morning, everyone, and welcome. After about as wet a weekend as I can remember, I hope that we'll get you to slightly higher, drier ground today at the CBI at 10. We're joined by Carolyn Fairbairn, the Director General of the CBI, and Andy Street, the Mayor of West Midlands. It feels as though this is a moment, Carolyn, where you do want to try and let some of the clouds clear and get a sense of what we're looking at in the next few weeks and months. And so, Andy, what you may know about these calls is that we've done them really since the very, very beginning of the pandemic. And the benefit of them has been to do two things. One is to hear from people like you directly how people in government are handling things, the conversations that Carolyn and her team at the CBI are having, often with number 10, number 11, Bays, the bank, etc. But what's really helpful is also getting direct feedback on what businesses are experiencing. And so often the call will try and field as many comments as possible. People who are familiar with CBI at 10 know that if you just put in your question or comment, I'll try and feed it to you, Andy, or to Carolyn. And if you want to do so anonymously, obviously we'll respect that. Just write anonymous at the start. But Andy, before we come to you, if I might, I'm just going to ask Carolyn just to sort of give us a sense of what you're hearing, Carolyn. It's now, there's been enough time, I suppose, 10 days or so for people to begin to digest the Chancellor's latest statement, the job support scheme. I imagine you've heard a lot from business on it. Do you want to sort of give us your sense of how business is responding, given that we are now in the month of October?
Absolutely, James. And good morning to you. Good morning, everybody. Terrific to have you with us, Andy. I think a really great time to be hearing directly from you. But James, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've had about 10 days now to digest, I think, what was a very big package of measures from the Chancellor. It's been wet and windy weather. It's also been pretty wet and windy in the economy. And even since the Chancellor made his announcements, things have moved on. We've had more local lockdowns. We've had the challenges around test and trace. So I think it's a good moment to just take stock. And yes, we've been hearing from hundreds of businesses in terms of their reaction. If I could just sort of summarize then. So the Chancellor's package really had two halves. It had a direct support half, which was about tax fundamentally and cash support, and then it had a job support side. On the extension of loan repayments, VAT deferral, very, very positive reaction. And from the hospitality industry, that reduction in VAT being extended through to March, really strong. And I think that understanding around the cash flow needs of business, the Chancellor showed he really got it. On the job support scheme, this inheritor scheme to the job retention scheme, I think the picture is mixed. So for manufacturing businesses, actually I've had a lot of firms get in touch with me directly to say this is a real help, because these are, in general, high-skilled people. It isn't just anybody you want to keep on, it's these particular people. It enables you to reduce the cost of keeping somebody on part-time from 100% of their salary, effectively to 55% of their salary. So that's been positive. I think it's been a lot less helpful to some of the most challenged sectors by the restrictions. For example, hospitality and live events have, I think, been very clear that this is far less helpful for them. And I think one of the things that we feel is that there now needs to be a kind of stock take on what more support might be necessary, and also whether the job support scheme, I think it should be kept under review in terms of how it works. But I think that the package overall was pretty balanced, but it doesn't work for everybody. And in terms of the sectors most under pressure, we saw some significant interventions last week. We had a letter on aviation from airports and airlines, which we were part of, where we really called for an airport testing trial, because this is what other countries are doing. On hospitality, we had two letters from the hospitality and live events sector to the Prime Minister, flagging the risk of huge job losses. And this is certainly the case. Live events, and Andy may have some direct things he wants to talk about from Birmingham and the NEC, are hugely affected here. And the Events Industry Alliance estimates that 80% of exhibition staff are at risk of losing their job and are likely to be made redundant as the JRS comes to a close. So incredibly high stakes time. And we do think that there are a number of additional measures that need to be kept under pretty urgent consideration by the government now, from testing in airports to the review of the 10 p.m. curfew that we think does not have, we'd like to see the evidence base behind that. And we are also, I think, now very interested to see what can be done around mass testing and also these ideas around a tiered approach to lockdown, which could be clarifying, but a very mixed picture, I think, in terms of the impact on different sectors from the Chancellor's package.
Carolyn, can I just pick up on one thing, and Andy, it'll be useful. I'll come to you directly afterwards. But on the job support scheme itself and on the Chancellor's package, my read of it, which is probably unfair, is that packages like that take some time to work up. And it felt as though it was a package that made sense for, if you like, the long haul, not the second wave. It felt like a package that made sense that you might have worked up over August and the beginning of September, when you thought you were going to continue to live with disruptions, but you weren't necessarily going to see the big escalation in infections and something that was not a second lockdown, but close to it in many parts of the country. Do you feel as though, in effect, the job support scheme is now a first step, and that there is going to need to be something that is a second step that matches the scale of infections and the scale of disruption that causes?
I think that's a fair analysis, James. Even if I think about the conversations that I was having with the Chancellor, a month ago, it feels as though things have moved on. The JSS is absolutely, I think it's actually a very good scheme. I think it is a scheme that is right for a certain kind of job, but it is for those sectors that are in recovery. They are able to bring people back on a part-time basis, and they want those particular people. They are protecting skills, and I think that's very significant. However, we are seeing an escalation in lockdowns where businesses are having to close again. We are seeing extra restrictions coming in again. And I think there are some interesting things to keep under review here. It's a JSS plus, if you like. So what some of the pluses could be, you could have, for example, an extension of furlough in its October form for parts of the country that are under the most severest of lockdowns. That could be one thought. You could have a reduction in the employer contribution for other parts of the country that were under potentially less severe lockdown. These are the kind of pluses that we think now need to be under consideration, given that I agree with you, we are in what feels like a different phase of this pandemic.
Carolyn, thanks. And I know lots of people on the call will want to talk a little bit about debt, testing, as you say, tiering, but Andy, it makes sense, I suppose, to start here if we can. Would you tell us a little about what you're seeing in Birmingham and the West Midlands around exactly what Carolyn was talking about? Sectors that are opening up, sectors that are sort of, if you like, in that long phase of recovery, and sectors that still feel shut down, and the kind of support that they need.
Yeah, it's a great question, and very pleased to be on and share some thoughts with you this morning. So thanks for the invitation. I suppose a simple point to make is I very much agree with Carolyn's analysis of it. If you look at our economy, the JSS has been welcomed, particularly by manufacturers, as it's been called out. And I think the simple way of thinking about this is it deals very well with businesses that are reopen, but are running somewhere below full capacity. So if you're a retailer as well, and you're dealing with footfall, depending on your locations, somewhere between 50% and nearly 100% in some of the out of town locations. So you're adjusting a model that is trading, but trying to cover your costs appropriately. Or if you're a manufacturer with 80-90% throughput, it works. But the big issue is the sectors that cannot open at all. And just to draw those out, we have a real issue here with the exhibition and conference sector. It's a huge success of predominantly Birmingham, less so the rest of the West Midlands economy, and obviously the NEC group is the poster child for that. They were expecting to open on the 1st of October. And then, of course, that date was cancelled. So they are now in the deep freeze, probably in terms of realistically, until about they're planning really certainly into the new year, probably March next year. So they have now started the second round of consultations on job losses, because the 55% number is actually of little use to them if the income is nil. So I am very clear that there is still a need for what Caroline described as a plus for those sectors that cannot trade at all. And obviously other elements of the live events industry would be part of that. And there's a big sort of destination for music, theatre. This is relevant to us as well. And of course, as you mentioned, large parts of aviation as well. So very aware of the letter last week and very supportive there. So that's the key distinction in terms of sectors.
And Andy, tell us a little bit about your conversations with central government on this, and particularly on this area, because one of the things that was striking in April, May, June, when we were holding these calls, was the government, for very understandable reasons, took a very horizontal approach to interventions in the economy. They wanted to design something that would effectively work for everyone. And it feels as though in the autumn, you're seeing these calls for much more targeted sectoral approaches. And so far, the government's not really, or struggling to respond to those. And I wondered, when you weigh in on behalf of, for example, the conference and exhibition sector, what kind of response you get?
So it's interesting. So the response was very good when we were thinking about how we were going to open up. So a really good conversation with the minister responsible, Nigel Huddleston, about how that was going to be done. Being very straight with you, James, we haven't had a very fruitful conversation about now the sector is closed, what is the sectoral support? And I think I sense that what Caroline said is right, that we were not expecting to be planning for this situation, and there needs to be a bit of reworking of it on the basis of but there has been, good support slightly earlier in the year to think about it sectoral.
And what do you think, Andy, just on more broadly on the question of greater regional powers, greater regional economic resources being made available to you to try and help with those interventions? How? I mean, I do think it must be incredibly difficult when big businesses are knocking at your door, and presumably your job is to then go and knock at the door of the Treasury.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, let's be realistic about it. The scale of the challenge, a regional authority is not going to have the cash to put in place a scheme, and frankly, a different scheme for the West Midlands to Greater Manchester for sectoral support would not be where we're going. But I do think there's an underlying fundamental point here that if you go into a local lockdown, the economic support that's needed for it almost needs to come hand in glove, and we don't yet have that. We do have a breakthrough on the individual support for people who are told to self-isolate. And you might have seen I was on the BBC a few weeks ago talking about that, because that's definitely necessary. There was a financial disincentive for people to follow the rules. That's now dealt with. But the argument now must be, if you do go into a local lockdown, and by the way, we haven't had that, we just have restrictions, and there's a very important difference, then there does need to be a package that comes alongside ready to go. And that's another area where we're discussing with central government. But perhaps the most important response to your question is we all get tied up with the immediate support, but a real role for regional leadership is thinking about what are going to be the critical parts of the economy post-pandemic, and how do we plan for the rebuilding there? And the way we're particularly thinking about that here, which of the pieces that are really what we call the critical assets of the economy, the things that mustn't be allowed to wither during the pandemic. And so obviously we've talked about aviation briefly, but for us, the automotive sector is absolutely mission critical internationally. So how do we defend those? And most importantly, help in the transformation in that sector around electrification that was going to happen anyway, and arguably quickened by this. And that's why we've been working with government on those long-term pieces as well.
Andy, that's really, really interesting. I want to make sure we devote some proper time to it, partly because people are fascinated by what's happening in the automotive sector as consumers, partly because it obviously intersects with the politics of Brexit, and partly too because it's nice to talk about something that has a longer horizon to it than the immediate. But forgive me, for 5-10 minutes or so, I'd like to just understand some of the immediate pressures and just pick up on, firstly, something you just said, Andy, and Karen, I'd like to get your view on this too. Karen just touched on tiering. You said we've got restrictions, we don't have lockdown. Can you just talk us through the communications challenge of what's happening in terms of understanding the requirements on people and businesses? And Karen, I'm going to come to you and get a sense of what you think and how you think this should be handled.
It's a really important question, James, because you hear the fatigue with all of this, the confusion. So oddly enough, one of the things I think we've done pretty well here is to try to be to try to get real clarity and simplicity in the communication of what we have. And also, most important, unity amongst political leadership here. So when we move, so what we've tried to do in terms of a process around this is obviously we have a weekly press conference, which is for all journalists across the region and is held by all the different public sector players. So myself, the leader of Birmingham City Council, the CEO of the NHS, the police. So one story in one place for all the journalists. And I have to say, they've responded incredibly well to having that simplicity. When we went into the restrictions 4 weeks ago now, really critical point, it was agreed with Matt Hancock before, personal conversations with him, and indeed having previously had conversations with the leaders of the local authorities. And bear in mind, this is a politically balanced place, some Conservative leaders, some Labour leaders, but we come together as one and then have one version of the truth for our citizens. And I genuinely think we have done a pretty decent job in a difficult situation, trying to be as clear and united as possible.
Carolyn, will you tell us how you think it should be done, and will you just talk us through what you think tiering might look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is it's actually really good to hear how good communications can be done from Andy, because I think clarity around how lockdowns work is so important. It's important for businesses. It's important for the general public. And it is absolutely right that we have local lockdowns as opposed to a national lockdown. I mean, this is what I think we thought we might get here. But I think there is a real challenge, because at the moment we have 9 different kinds of local lockdown. There are 4 in Greater Manchester alone. And, I just know, even from listening to the news, I'm sort of losing track of what's happening where and what it's like, out on the ground when you're trying to keep up. It's impossible. So one of the things that we know has been used internationally in Canada, where I spent some time this summer, they have a tiering system where instead of having lots of completely different kinds of lockdown, you actually have categories of lockdown, and they can be red, amber, green. And you know that if you're in a red zone, that's what your lockdown looks like. If you're in a green zone, that's what your lockdown looks like. And it is very clarifying for people, because the public get to know what they mean, businesses know what they mean, and we think it could be very helpful. Crucial though, and it's something that Andy mentioned, if you are going to work on that system, you need to have the financial packages for business that go hand in hand with those colour codes, and that they are announced absolutely at the same time. Because what we have seen in the last few weeks, James, is the restrictions come in, and then there's radio silence, and then the packages come in, days later or even weeks later. Meantime, a lot of damage has been done. Yep. So we think there is opportunity here. We know that it's being discussed in government. We are looking for white smoke on this, but it could be, I think, a really helpful thing.
Okay, thank you, Karen. And I'll take from what you said that there is understanding in government of that mirroring of clarity around health restrictions and clarity around economic support, that they're beginning to think about that too.
I think so. I mean, we have been saying this time, and it keeps on not happening, if I am totally honest. So we will keep on saying it, and that's why it's really interesting to hear you say the same thing, Andy, at the local level.
Yeah, we need the truth is, James, we need to see the evidence of that, and I think obviously
I'm
wretched.
laughing. I've been talking for weeks now with friends about the fact that this form of digital conversation, you know, the way we do everything now, is really difficult because you don't get the benefit of the non-verbal in a conversation. But looking at your face as Carolyn was speaking, you were living disproof of that.
I gave it away.
To tell you a lot.
People say that I should never play poker because I give it away too easy.
Andy, can we talk about one other element? You talked about economic support for those people who are testing and being asked to self-isolate.
Yeah.
Earlier in the summer, there was clearly, it seemed to me as though there were a set of really significant concerns about the central operation of test and trace. Right. One was obviously about centralization of labs. The second was around not knowing communities, not knowing how to contact people, language issues, door knocks. And the third was statutory sick pay, and that proving to be a disincentive for people, particularly on contract, from taking up self-isolate. What's the picture that you've now got in the West Midlands of test and trace, how effective it is, and where the gaps are?
Yep. Okay. Oddly enough, the picture hasn't really changed since it was launched at the end of May, and that might sound quite shocking 4 months in. But broadly, about 65% of contacts are being traced centrally. And that number has literally been surprising how stable it's been. What's changed is an acknowledgement that it can't all be done centrally. And so now what is happening in the West Midlands authorities, Sandwell was the first to do it, but it's actually on massive scale in Birmingham now, is actually there is a local structure that goes alongside that. So the contacts that are not dealt with centrally are then followed up by literally local boots on the ground. And to be honest, we were saying right at the beginning that that will be necessary. So I do think one of the underlying points here is this tension between central directive and assumption things can be run from London, and actually a realization that some things have to be best run locally. And I understand in a crisis you get this central command and control piece, but actually the lesson has been you have to have both elements. And just on the local piece, we are literally hitting 98, 99% of people on the list being followed up locally. So there's evidence that boots on the ground really does work.
And is it moving that critical 65% number?
No, the 65% of those dealt with centrally has been stuck absolutely since the start. So then the point is the balance is then followed up locally. But it's the sort of fascinating point about the 65 is there's probably something systemic that tells you that is never going to change.
And sorry, what I mean by that, Andy, does that mean that with the combination of the local door knock, the local contacts, you are getting significantly above that 65% number?
Yes, it does. Sorry, yes, it does. It means you get to a number, varies by different local authorities, but low 80s when you take the combination of the two.
Okay, that's interesting. And then can I talk about the economic support? I know you raised this a few weeks back. Are you satisfied that the economic support is sufficient, that if you do get contacted, it's economically viable to self-isolate?
If you are on low pay, the arrangement is now, I think, respectable. It's considerably more than the trial that was done in Bolton some weeks ago. So yes, I do think there has been a decisive response to that.
Okay, all right. And people on short-term contracts, some of those freelance contracts, 0 hours contracts, are they sufficiently supported?
It depends on exactly what their personal situation is. So the answer is some and some, actually.
Okay, all right.
Sorry to not be precise, but it's not.
No. I think it's. Yeah. I think we're all beginning to understand just the scale and the breadth, the complexity of this. There are a number of people who've been asking questions as we've been talking, which are about that longer-term picture that you touched on.
Yeah.
And so, if I can, I'd like just to take you back to that. I know the CBI is thinking a lot about this whole question of how the country builds back from here. So, what's the pitch for how the West Midlands comes out of the pandemic?
Okay, so see evidence A. So we don't sit around waiting for you to ask us this question on a Monday morning. So we actually came together as a region with business playing a critical role. It's one thing about how I like to do this job, but I like to have business inside the tent in the decision making. And we produced our paper that we call Recharge the West Midlands. And this was basically about the key part of the economic plan for the region. I suppose boiling it down, it had three things. A massive part about the retraining and reskilling, and obviously we've now seen the government respond to that to some extent, but that's absolutely critical because we need to have those options there when people do fall out of their jobs over the next few months. The second part is pressing on with the big supply side pieces for improving the underlying competitiveness of the economy here. And I hope this isn't indulgent, but before the pandemic, we'd actually had 10 years of being the fastest growing region in Britain. And that for the West Midlands is a bloody miracle, having had 4 decades of being the worst. But a lot of that was about concentrating on those key things about transport, housing, skills and energy, making sure that we continue with that. So if I may say, Carolyn, lovely to see your press release on Friday about the importance of regional transport. So do not lose your nerve on continuing to invest in those big infrastructure projects. And obviously for us, HS2 is the mummy and daddy of that. But then the third part was which sectors provide the growth and the new jobs and making this place really competitive in the future. And obviously the electrification of automotive is critical there, but actually life science is also critical to us, and the fantastic growth that's been in that sector here, what's now required, particularly around translational medicine. And then the third sector we were really calling out was the creative sector on the back, and again on the back of HS2 being the stimulus and the regeneration of the city centre locations around that. So we were looking for the big gear shift opportunities where there'll be new high quality jobs for us in the future. And then you go straight back to, and what's the training put in place? And some of what we were asking was government investment behind some of those things. If I give you the most obvious specific example, the electrification of the automotive industry will only happen if there is a gigafactory, a battery manufacturing centre here, and the government will, as in every other country in Europe, need to subsidise that to some extent. And so we were arguing we wanted to work with government, with the supplier, with the ultimate manufacturer, in our case JLR, to make sure that that does come. And if on the back of the pandemic that were to come forward, it would be a bloody good leap forward.
And can you tell us a little bit more, Andy, about particularly those three: automotive, life sciences, and the creative sector? I was talking to Jerry Grimstone, Lord Grimstone, who's now the Minister for Investment, talking about the gap between sort of big ideas that government has and investable projects, and how you actually package those up in ways that they can be investable either domestically or to international investors. What's the coordination around these scale of projects between what you are doing regionally and what the central government is trying to do in terms of bringing investment into the UK?
Yeah, fascinating question. Let's take the Gigafactory because it is actually a brilliant example of this, and it actually tells you a lot about what the role of government needs to be. I can write every strategic document I want on this. JLR, frankly, can say they want to buy these products. On our own, it will not bring this about. The missing ingredient has to be, as it's been in every country in Europe, a central government role. So what we have to do is make the proposition, in this case, an ultimate customer. And of course, we would have to then be and dealing with all the issues locally around land assembly, the planning. That's what we have to do. But then ultimately, we have to say to DIT, we need you to secure the international investor who is going to put down hundreds of millions of pounds here. And actually, we need the base part of government to actually deliver the support for that. And that will come out of what the government are calling the Automotive Electrification Fund. So what you see from that little story is that you need central government to play that coordinating role. And my honest view is that BEIS needs to be far, far more willing to step forward to play that role, and the sort of laissez-faire believing that this will suddenly happen on its own just isn't the case. It's a classic example of where we need BEIS to step to actually help us shape our future economy.
Andy, thank you. Karen, do you want to weigh in on this? Because it's put so compellingly by Andy, but it's also a revolution in thinking in the business world that there's not picking national champions, but there are chosen sectors, and how you see that working, and how you think government can work effectively, and when it actually gets in the way.
Well, absolutely, and it's great to be having a conversation about competitiveness. Even in the throes of where we are now, because it is so important that we think this way. And I think we're coming in really strongly behind the gigafactory idea, because this is long-term strategic planning for the country. And other nations are doing it. And this point about the role of central government, I think, is really crucial. It is in those sectors where actually it is about long-term commitment of an entire country to a sector that international investors want to see. And we do have experience in this over decades. So our aerospace and aviation sector and automotive have all benefited from, dare I use that old word from a previous regime, industrial strategy. It is about having that sort of long-term framework for commercial and government partnership. So this is absolutely fundamental. We also would like to see the government step up here. We also think, I think batteries is one area, hydrogen is another. We call for £1 billion investment in the spending review behind hydrogen, because we think we have a huge UK source of competitive advantage in this. So couldn't agree more with Andy. And there is something I think really powerful about the impetus of the pandemic to get these things right. And I think it's terrific that we've got a West Midlands plan out there. And we have got the CSR, the spending review coming up. There are opportunities now for governments to put their stake in the ground. And I think international investors are watching. This is a moment where we could really put the UK brand out there in a very strong way.
Andy, can I ask you, how does Brexit fit in with this? What are you currently planning for?
Oh dear, I thought we were going to have the conversation without that. It's hugely significant. There's no point me rerunning the whole political argument. I was on the losing side of that argument, but there is every point in us just going through the criticality of free trade deal or West Midlands business. Now, naturally, we think of the manufacturing and export sector here, and just to give you the stat, which will make people realise how important this is. This is the part of the country that has most dependence on exports of any part. 24% of our GDP is from exporting product. That figure in London is 8%. So this matters.
8%, you said?
So 24% of West Midlands GDP is 8% of London's GDP. So this matters big time. And I know there's a
pardon? That 24%, how does it break down in terms of where it goes to?
Well, by far the biggest market, and I know some will say it's only onward dipping, is the EU. So that is by a country. I think it's 42% is EU. But so that's the don't quote me exactly on that, but it's broadly right. So that's by far the biggest market. And so all the predictions is there is a no deal that the West Midlands economy will contract relatively more than any other part of the country. Arguably the Northeast is equivalent to us. So I was talking to Michael Gove about this on Saturday. It is absolutely mission critical that whilst the political will of the general election is of course respected, that there is a free trade deal established so that goods can still move tariff free, and particularly in the just-in-time supply chains, they can move tariff free. But
and Andy, can I just ask you, my sort of Delphic oracle on this, I'm afraid to say, is Carolyn, right, who's been saying for some time that more likely than not, you get a deal, but it's probably a very skinny deal. Is that a fair summary, Carolyn, of what you've been saying?
I think it is. We use various adjectives over the months, but I think skinny is the best for the moment. But I think in terms of the sectors that are most important for the West Midlands, having a tariff-free, quota-free settlement is of fundamental importance. There are many other things that we'd want to build onto that over the course of the coming months, but I think even, a skinny deal would be. Andy, do correct me, but I think that would be a tremendous help.
Absolutely. So our understanding is that a skinny deal would include tariff-free. Exactly. If that is the case, That is the single most important thing. There are lots of other aspects. There's lots of other sectors affected by this as well. But please, those listening, don't think this is a unique West Midlands manufacturing case. But that would be an enormous assistance.
Right. Okay. So that's the. So I think for those of us who are outside the finer points of the negotiation and trying to understand what the difference is between, as you say, a deal that is sufficient that it doesn't cause that big dent to prospects for the West Midlands. Tariffs is the critical thing. There's a lot more to go from. That's the critical thing, right? Can I just? I want to come back.
Mention one other thing as well. One other thing, and this is very naughty, but you'll like this, James. You might even write it down. The value of the car for the automotive industry to this country is roughly 40 times the fishing industry. Now, you tell me which has had more political attention.
Right, 40 times.
Yes.
Okay, well, I will write it down, and
you can check it up again. My stat might not be precise, but it ain't far wrong, and it's just interesting where the zeitgeist of the nation is.
Can I want to come back at the end, Carolyn, if I might, just to talk to you a little bit about what Andy's talking about, sort of the longer term. A lot of people this morning are asking questions about planning for the longer term.
Yeah.
But Andy, before we do that, I just wanted to get a sense from you. You hear very different things about the nature of a devolved Britain and the extent to which mayors and other metro mayors are working together, the extent to which the four nations of the UK are working together. And certainly one of the recurrent themes of these conversations, these CBI conversations, has been quite a level of frustration among businesses about different rules, different ways of working. I imagine you've thought a good deal about this. Are there lessons we can learn about how government can seem more coordinated, or perhaps it is more coordinated behind the scenes than we know?
I'm not quite trying to understand where
what I'm trying to say is, how, if you're a business that's working in lots of different places, do you deal with the fact that you're getting lots of different authorities or, you know, national governments within the UK setting different sets of rules?
Yeah, yeah, it's very fair. I'm not a believer, for example, in differential income tax rates in different areas. So I do think the general point has to be a standard business, let's call it landscape, is what is required. And I get the point about over complexity of different areas. But I don't think that, in a sense, mitigates against how I hope the next devolution white paper will go forward. So let's just think what I hope will happen. If you connect the conversation together, we've got a clear view of what our economic plan needs to be, where our economic success needs to come from. But you have to have cash to make it happen. At the moment, in any devolved part of Britain, London included, England, that's the great contrast. In England, we do not have tax raising powers to be able to put muscle behind our plans. So we're constantly in the begging bowl with central London. So civil servants in London are judging every piece. Nothing against them, but it cannot be the best use of their time and skill to be judging relatively small pieces. What we've got to move to is that English regions have some financial muscle to be able to implement their plan. But it does not mean we end up with a sort of patchwork quilt of different regulation in every different area. But if you take something like air passenger duty, vehicle excise duty, could even be a slice of local VAT. If that was held here, or a critical one, energy company obligations, everyone pays that on their bill without even knowing. In Scotland, that's the board that gives them firepower, nowhere in England. So it's that idea of devolving some of the cash so that we've got muscle behind our plans is where I think the next big sort of point of principle is in this.
That's really interesting. So differential revenue, but not differential tax setting powers.
Correct.
Interesting. Andy, thank you so much. It's really interesting. I'm going to put to both of you, but if I might, Carolyn first, one final question, really a big thing, which is the 6-month view, right? There's a reasonable expectation when you speak to those working in the science that you're going to the possibility of a really significant ramp up in tests between now and the end of the year, the possibility of a vaccine that begins to get distributed by the Easter of next year, And already the signs of therapies, plasma, Regeneron, these therapies that are beginning to significantly diminish the mortality rates, i.e. the first quarter of 2021 might look very different from the fourth quarter of 2020. When you think about those things, Carolyn, and you begin to see an outline of what the health impacts are like, what do you think should be the economic planning that accompanies it?
Yeah. So I share that optimism that a combination of Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, which I think you've outlined, vaccine, testing, and therapy, will enable us to get to grips with the virus over the course of the next 12 months from a health point of view. We got a huge innovation going into those three areas. And in terms of the economic plan, I think we've got a real opportunity that's parallel to that. And it's partly about restating the vision for the economy. And whenever I talk to number 10 about this, they say, look at the manifesto because it hasn't changed. And actually that's quite helpful, because within the manifesto, they talk about training, they talk about tech, they talk about digital connectivity, all things that, and real infrastructure, things that Andy's talked about. But I think that the plan we need to now have alongside it has to also have a sort of therapeutic element for the economy alongside that. So we do need to be able to deal with the debt. I mean, there is going to be a significant debt burden on the public and private sector. We are going to have to deal with a different shape of economy. The scale of working from home, I think, is transformative. And so we need to be thinking about that. What the future of commuting is, I think that has changed fundamentally as well. So I think that there is an opportunity now for a real revving up of the economic plan to sit alongside that health plan. We'll see elements of it possibly even the next couple of days, even today from the Chancellor. The spending review is absolutely fundamental, but it will have those different components of recognising the debt challenges, but also the investments that Andy has talked about. And I think we can quite usefully go back to the manifesto to see where the government wants to take this.
Interesting. Andy, what's your advice to businesses thinking about the longer term?
Oh, you've asked me a different question to what I thought you were going to ask me there. I think you asked me to comment on that. I suppose this could sound terribly glib, but I do think it's right. As Carolyn said, we're not going back to what we used to describe as normal. We thought when the furlough scheme came in, we got this B valley and we were going to bridge over it, and we're to normal, not to be. So it is going to be different, but in difference does come opportunity. And it's very hard to see that at a time where we're all battling the current latest case numbers and everything. But actually, the businesses that will really thrive over the next 10 years will be those who see the differences and think, how are we going to really fight that? And a really good example of that is what is going to be going on in our city centres in the future. There's all sorts of challenges to commercial property, but my goodness, A, there's a lot of money to be invested, and B, there will be some different uses coming. And similarly in the housing sector, people will be thinking very differently about what accommodation they want. So I know it sounds so simple to say, but it genuinely is about where are the new opportunities in these differences. And if you look back at 2008, the businesses that really came out strongest from 2008 are those who took the trough to reinvent themselves to some extent. So hard when you're battling the virus to do that, but that's what's required. And it's also required of politicians, by the way, and it's what's required of government leadership in it.
Andy, thanks very much. Listen, I have to say this is a strangely good start to the week, I have to say, both in terms of us looking in greater detail at what's going on now, but also thank you both, Andy and Carolyn, for helping us to raise our sights a little bit beyond what's happening right here and now. On Wednesday, CBI at 10 comes 15 minutes late. It's going to be CBI at 10:15. We're joined by Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, so I look forward to being on there. But for today, big thank you to Andy Street, and as ever, thank you, Carolyn Fairburn. Have a good week, everyone.